Hello, I'm David. I'm a retired nurse and community educator at Clark College Community Education Program. I teach classes on the neuroscience of resiliency, on nutrition, on community engagement, and since 2017, twice a year, I've been teaching classes on cannabis and your health in the community education department at Clark College.
Hi everybody, I'm Helen. I'm a retired city planner and a lifelong learner and a healthy aging advocate. I'm working right now to bring a home share program to Clark County as well as the Aging Mastery program. And I also volunteer with Villages Northwest, having started Villages Clark County.
Hi, I'm Daria, a community advocate, and I work at the public library in Vancouver.
Okay, let's talk about drugs today.
When you say drugs, I think of crime. I think about drug cartels and heroin addiction and meth running communities. And I mean, I know that there are good drugs and there are bad drugs, but what makes drugs illegal and not others?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think about pain. I think about pain relief. I think about people who need chemotherapy and kids with asthma, surgery, all these things you might need drugs for. But cannabis is legal now. Why is it still so controversial?
Well, there's a reason for that, and I want to talk about that today. Why some drugs are illegal and some are not. And of course, some are highly addictive and can be very personally destructive. But as we know, some drugs are lifesavers and can come directly from nature, like St. John's wort for depression. And you may know it as weed or marijuana, but cannabis, its botanical name, is documented worldwide and for at least 10,000 years has been used as a highly valuable healer of many ailments.
Really? 10,000 years?
Yeah, kind of like Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, 10 or 12,000 years ago. I think we sometimes get hung up and think pot from the 60s. It just got invented, but it didn't. It has a long history. And I'm very interested, David, in having you talk about that, about its fall from grace and the renewed interest in its healing properties and applications.
I'd love to know all of this.
Well, that's great because I've distilled a few slides and images from my 10-hour class I teach in the Clark College Community Education, and I'm going to pop those up here and share them on our Zoom platform, and then we can respond to that. I'd like to hear your response to that, to the information and the imagery. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to pop it up here. Cannabis in the Coup from the beginning, and from the beginning, there we go. Whoop. There we go. Now it's the beginning. So we're going to talk about the cultural and legal history of cannabis today, and how we use it medicinally, and then how it became illegal in the United States and other places in the world. So you can see this map here about how it migrated with the populations, and it started in the area of Afghanistan and Tajikistan back when we started farming about 10,000 years ago. And if you read Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire, he encourages us to look at all plants, like we look at bees pollinating flowers. Bees are attracted to the scent of particular plants and their flowers, and they use that to pollinate and to spread the pollen across different regions. Human beings did the same things. They take seeds that they found useful, and they took them with us, and we took them to China, and then into Taiwan and Japan, and then finally, when the trade routes opened up, we took them over into Europe in the Middle Ages and down into Africa. And then when we started exploring the oceans, over into South America, and finally in the 1600s to America. So going back now, human beings smoked cannabis as part of a ritualized burial ceremonies 2,500 years ago according to the latest evidence of unearthed burial sites in the Pamir Plateau in Western China. So here's a brazier that hot stones were put into, and then the cannabis flower was put on top of it, and people would inhale it as part of a ritual ceremony. And then we also know from this tomb of this woman from 2500 BCE that marijuana buds containing high levels of THC were found in a basket packed next to her head. And I think there was like about 2 pounds of it. So it was a very valuable product for people, and a ritual herb that people used. Thinking about the phrase coined, I forget the poet's name, Wallace Stevens, no, Wendell Berry. Ancient knowledge seeking new minds. 2900 BC, the Chinese emperor, I'm not sure about the pronunciation, Fu Xi, references marijuana as a popular medicine. That was the first recorded history of it. That's the Chinese created writing, so that's how we knew people were using it, in addition to unearthing the tombs. And it was known for he was known for bringing civilization to China through writing, and he recognized cannabis, called ma by the Chinese, as an effective medicine with wide applications. So I'm going to stop sharing right now, and I just want to get your response to that kind of information about that, about how we use it as our original apothecary and pharmacopoeia.
Well, I guess the first thing I think is
blows your mind.
Yeah, it does. And how did it get to America? And if it was so revered, how did it become illegal?
Well, Helen, any thoughts on that? On the images there in the slides?
I'm still hung up on the corpse of the reposing lady. I'm still thinking that's out of Twilight, one of those Twilight movies or something. I got a little hung up on that part. Sorry, David.
Well, yeah, it's a pretty powerful image.
Yes.
What's interesting about that is that the people only buried things with people that were of immense value to that person and to the community, and represented some sort of holiness or ritual value. So that's what's interesting.
Yes, David, that's what's interesting about that slide, is because how did something that was so revered, that would be like you would bury your relatives with their jewelry and things, and so they buried them with cannabis, or the evidence of use of cannabis, but somewhere it lost its way and it's not revered like, or I'm going to say, let's just talk about the general population, maybe not some of us who revere it more than others. But how did it lose its status that way? How did it end up just, being this, illegal, horrible thing that dirty hippies smoke, and not something that's revered like gold and silver and jewelry in our culture?
Right. Interesting. So can I share the screen back with you? Any other thoughts about that? Sure. I'll go back to the screen here. And I have to go back to this because we're on Zoom. And here we go. So from the current slide, here we go. So you were talking about how to get to America. Well, and you saw on the map that all the human migrations. Well, in addition to being something that was used for health management and pain and treatment of illnesses, there was a utilitarian use for cannabis as well. And that was the hemp, a variety of cannabis that was used to make rope and sails, and also the seeds were used because they have high omega-3 content, so they were nutritional supplement, and they were used on voyages. The Vikings used cannabis in their sails and ropes, but they also had the hemp seed that they used on their ocean voyages. So that's how it got to the United States. And that was how it was used as a normal product that people used, and had all these multiple uses for it. And then, so in fact, as this slide shows, the first US marijuana law forced farmers to grow hemp in the Jamestown colony in 1619 because it was such a valuable crop for rope, for clothing, for sails, and for the seed, for the nutritional value of it. And I'm going to pop into the next slide here in just a second. By the 1850s, we figured out a way to do alcohol distillations, and we had cannabis tinctures all the way up until the 1930s. You can see the labels here with the products in it and how much alcohol it had in it, and the different companies that were selling that. So, but then in the early 1900s, so after the influx of Mexican immigrants fleeing from the chaos of the Mexican Revolution, the United States started to pass laws outlawing marijuana, preparation of hemp that was brought with them. Now, marijuana was not a term that was even heard of in the United States. It was called cannabis, and it had been called by its botanical name over in China and throughout Europe. Marijuana was a slang name that came from the west coast of Mexico, and that was a name that was used by the immigrants as they came in, the Mexican immigrants as they came in the United States. So just wanted to clarify that. And that's why I use the word cannabis, because it's the botanical name. And the pejorative term is marijuana, which, as you'll see here in a moment, has very racist overtones. So what happens is then in the early 1900s, you have the confluence of concerns about patent medicine, realistic, what's in it. You can remember those old Western movies where people are selling stuff off the back of wagons and people can walk again and all that, and you don't know what's in the product, right?
Snake oil salesman.
Snake oil salesman, that's the word I was looking for. But cannabis was it was proprietary, and it was produced, and there was some purity to it, but it was different than it was slightly different than the snake oils. So, and at the same time, we were looking at listing all the products in the patent medicine, a good thing. There was also an interest in more science from the American Medical Association, and that there would be a reliable, consistent science available that people could go to. So that's also a good thing. But also at the same time, there was also all these immigrant groups coming in the United States that were putting pressure on employment, and it was raising concerns about too many of this people or too many of that people coming in. And we saw that prior to the prohibition against marijuana, when poppies and heroin production was linked to Chinese immigration, and we cut off Chinese immigration in the between 1910 and 1915 and 1920s, using that same kind of language. So right down here at the bottom of the slide, you see a quote from a Texas senator: "All Mexicans are crazy, and this stuff, marijuana, is what makes them crazy." So then you have prohibition that comes in and are concerned, some of it realistic about the overuse of alcohol, and the temperance movement. And the prohibition came from the temperance movement, and the concern for too many people are dying of alcohol poisoning and alcohol. But they used prohibition rather than public health, which, as we all know, was a mistake, even though we continue to make that same mistake these days. Mm-hmm. So after prohibition ended, there was a man named Harry Anslinger who was part of the prohibition movement and was one of the promoters of that in the United States. And so the president came to him at that time and asked him to create the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and that was the first head of that was Harry J. Anslinger. And he used language that was trying to associate cannabis or marijuana, and then also got cannabis grouped in with that by saying reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. That's a direct quote from him. And then you see these kind of posters that are up all over town, right? Scaring the shit out of people. pardon my language, scaring the hell out of people. So, and making them worry about that. And what people didn't realize when they were talking about marijuana, that cannabis was the same pharmaceutical preparation, just in a different form. So they didn't realize at the time that by making marijuana illegal, they were also making cannabis illegal. So what happens then in 1937, there's enough hysteria and concern that grows up around this that Anslinger gets Congress to pass a marijuana tax that makes it prohibitive for doctors and patients to buy it, which is very similar to what's going on now. It's really severely taxed, so medical marijuana or cannabis patients can't really afford to buy it, especially those in the disabled community. And I'm going to talk about in future, we might get to that in a future talk. So, so here's Harry Anslinger, another quote from him. In the 1930 Federal Narcotics Bureau, you see who's that over there? Satchmo, who's playing the horn, right? And there was a lot of songs about reefer because a lot of musicians were using it. And they used then that imagery of the darkies and of jazz and of Hispanics and Negroes and entertainers. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. There are 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the US, and most are Negroes, Hispanic, Filipinos, and entertainers, not our people. There's satanic music, that's a pretty provocative phrase. Jazz and swing result from marijuana use. This marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and others. Kind of reminds me of what my parents thought about rock and roll in the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so let's fast forward to, so you had the marijuana tax and the Drug Enforcement Administration, and then we had another look at it in the 60s and the 70s with the Cultural Revolution and people looking at alternative sources for relaxation. So it was Nixon's campaign, law and order campaign in his second election. He commissioned something called the Schaefer Commission, where he had a Ohio governor who was known to be a staunch conservative to head up a commission. And the results of that were that marijuana does not cause crime, aggression, or lead to harder drug use, or create significant biochemical, medical, or physical abnormalities. Its relative potential for harm in the vast majority of individual users does not justify a social policy to firmly punish those who use it, and recommended personal use of marijuana should be decriminalized. This is 1972.
Wow.
This was the finding of a bipartisan commission. So what the heck happened?
Yeah.
Nixon rejected the Schaefer Commission, recommended that it became a Schedule I drug, and after 1973 creation of the Drug Enforcement Administration and the DEA, it still remains a Schedule I drug. Now, the interesting thing about this, going back to Anslinger, he used the same racist language that Anslinger used because of his need to get the Southern vote. And he did it this way. And this, as Alderman and Ehrlichman have testified, have written in their diaries, this was the language, and it's actually on the Nixon tapes. You have to face, quote unquote, you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks, the homosexuals, and the Jews. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. That was the law, and then you put that underneath law and order, and you're off to the races, and that's what they did.
Wow.
So the result of that, yeah, wow. Because the result of that is that the United States has filled up its jails and prisons with drug offenders. And that leads us to today, where we have 5% of the world population and 25% of the world's prisoners. It's unconscionable. It makes me absolutely sick to see
Yeah.
this. Having worked in mental health in the criminal justice system, because it totally, it totally undermines our idea of justice. And it also undermines the erosion of the Sixth Amendment, the right to a jury trial, because harsh mandatory minimum sentence that came with Nixon and then Reagan and then Bush and even Clinton and Biden, which is what we're talking about now with the current election, is the presumption of innocence is lost. Asset forfeiture allows the government to seize assets without proving guilt. And the highest number of assets forfeitures that has happened is with marijuana convictions. So that led to the racial disparity in arrest and prosecutions for violating marijuana possession laws. And in a 2020 analysis by the American Civil Liberties Union, they concluded that Black people are 3.6 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession, notwithstanding comparable usage rates among white populations. So it's clearly a biased treatment, and we can talk about cognitive bias and all those things that happen when you're just exposed to this time and time again, like those Harry Anslinger imagery and then Nixon and Reagan and those coming on after that. So in every single state, this is current, Black people were and are more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. This also goes to brown people. And in some states, Black people are up to 6 or 8 times more likely to be arrested. In 31 states today, racial disparities were actually larger in 2018 than they were in 2010.
Wow.
So
David, I got a question for you here on this.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of the first thing we think is like follow the money and who benefits. How does this coincide with the privatization of prisons?
Big time. I had, I didn't, in my opening statement, I didn't talk about my work in justice. I worked for 10 years in the juvenile justice system as the victim impact coordinator for the Clark County Juvenile Court, liaisoning between the prosecuting attorney, juvenile court, and probation counselors. And in that process, I got educated about public versus private corrections. And what happened was, in cost-saving measures, the state, certain states ported over their management of corrections, of probations, and prisons and jails to private industry. And with the idea that they would still have accountability, right? So you build up this private prison industry, and they then have huge lobbying power with Congress. Think about drug companies lobbying with Congress, billions and millions of dollars. The private prison and probation system and fee collection system are of that same category. So they're pushing so that they can make money off incarcerating people for nonviolent crimes and crimes that we now know, and we'll talk about this in a minute, of many states who are now expunging the history of marijuana crimes from people's records, because it's only fair now that it's legal in their states. But it took 6 years in Colorado for them to do that. And if you see the harm and the damage that having a drug crime on, you can't get credit, you can't go to school, you can go to school, but you can't get scholarships. You're marked for life on this. So, and plus you also have to pay those damn fees that they charge percentage of interest on, but you aren't paying it. And you aren't paying it. So it's an insidious loop of harm that it causes.
It's interesting because when you're, oh, go ahead.
It brings up the issue of when have you paid your debt to society? If you've been in prison for 10 years for the sale of marijuana, when have you paid your debt? What more do you have to do? I think we decided as a society that is your punishment. And so, wow, that's just
what's happening in, oh, I'm sorry, Helen, go ahead.
No, go ahead, that's fine.
So this is actually being discussed when you get your voting rights back when you're a felon, right? So in Florida, for example, you have to pay off all your restitution. This is what they're discussing as a law about whether to require everybody to pay off all their restitution, the fines and fees and all the interest accrued because you can't pay for it because of the aggressive fee schedules of these private probation companies.
Yeah.
So the answer is never.
Yeah.
Never. And that's the way they disenfranchise voting and people to vote as well. Yeah. And we can get, and that's what we're talking about right now, right?
Yep.
With the post office and everything. So it's very, very, very insidious, very harmful, and it's destructive to our society. And especially since we're not using a public health model, like the science-based and evidence-based says that drug abuse use needs to be ported over from criminal justice to public health and have it evidence-based and science-based. So any more thoughts about that?
Well, you know what?
I have. Go ahead.
I mean, it's upsetting me. I'm sure you guys are going, what the?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Darian.
Go ahead, Helen. Okay, I'll say, what I was going to say is what is deeply troubling to me is when you speak about restitution, instead of having this understanding, this medical and legal understanding, it reminds me of like when you say something about somebody in the paper and then the retraction doesn't get any play. It's like everything that you're saying to begin with, that it was originally from, if I understand you correctly, that there was never a crime aspect. It was always a racism thing. And then the people that profited from this, it was basically political. And now we know better, and yet the general public definitely does not know better. So there's still, like when we first started talking about this with you, Helen, it's like it still has that smell of like something bad, and in fact, it never was.
No, it was used as a tool to disenfranchise people and bring other people into power. Think of debtors' prisons.
Yeah.
Right? Debtors' prisons. And people are saying the same thing now. Well, if you don't pay your fines, you go back to prison. You have a choice of paying your fines, go back to jail.
Well,
Same
I mean,
idea.
and bail, So, you get pulled over, you've got some pot, they throw you in jail. If you can't pay bail, then you're stuck in jail. But hey, you got some money, you can get yourself out of jail. Well, this is not right. This is not right.
Yeah, and the money goes to the jail instead of the public health addiction treatment system.
Yeah.
And there's an opportunity to talk about our addiction science and services. That's been radically updated with evidence-based practice, and we have the wrong approach for addiction treatment as well.
So David, do the studies now in 2020, I know in the recovery community, they talk about marijuana as a gateway drug. This is discussed a lot. So are you saying that now really the studies and the statistics show that if that's really not the case?
It's been it's been debunked. That's a great question. Thank you. That's a great question. And that's what a lot of people are thinking about. Well, what about the gateway? What about drugs? And so in my work in mental health, when we look at the evidence-based and science-based understanding of what causes addiction, it's early childhood trauma. It changes the neurophysiology and the ability to regulate your emotions, where you learn to use other adaptive lifestyles naturally because you don't have the internal self-regulation that comes because of the dysregulation from living in chaotic, under-resourced, poverty environments.
So David, that can be a separate one that we do on childhood trauma and epigenetics, because I think more and more we're really starting to understand that to really understand a person and to get to know a person and their motives, you've got to really understand something about their childhood and how they were raised, and it'll shine a whole lot of light on how and why they're reacting the way they do now.
the bumper sticker for that is all behavior has meaning. That's from the adverse childhood experience studies. And the other piece of this is that I just want to read a little quote to you, because you were talking about addiction potential and stuff like this. I'm going to read this quote to you and see who you think said it, okay? Whether it was a drug dealer, a drug user, cannabis user, or maybe someone in the medical profession. I mistakenly believed the Drug Enforcement Agency listed as a Schedule I substance abuse, that cannabis was listed as a Schedule I substance abuse substance, had sound scientific proof. They didn't have the science to support that claim. It doesn't have a high potential for abuse, and there are very legitimate medical applications for cannabis. That's clear. In fact, sometimes cannabis is the only thing that works, and it is medically unethical to say differently at this time, given what we know. It's medically unethical. Who said that?
Sanjay Gupta.
On CNN. And on Seth Meyers too. So he's been talking about this, and it's because of the way, and we can get into this in the future, because of the way the DEA has a lock on research in the United States. Not so in other countries, but having said that, the World Health Organization took the lead from the United States and criminalized it in many countries around the world until that's right. And they're also doing that with other things like sugar and things like that too, because we have such a huge economy, we can be the bully pulpit, right?
Yeah.
And so Sanjay Gupta said that.
What's Schedule I? What does that mean? And
good. It has no medical value or use. Schedule II means it has some. Schedule III means that you can research it, and Schedule IV is that it's totally acceptable. Pardon me. So,
which would put OxyContin as a Schedule I, right?
OxyContin is now Schedule II.
Oh, Schedule II.
Because it has medical uses, right?
If it doesn't kill you, it has medical uses.
Well, that's another quote from Sanjay Gupta. He says, cannabis, OxyContin and other pharmaceutical drugs cause X number of overdoses a year, and we know the literature on that. It's an epidemic of drug overdoses in the United States. Still going on, especially with the pandemic going on. We're experiencing that. But there's never been an overdose death from cannabis. Never recorded overdose death. People, now that's not saying it's a panacea, and it can interact with people who have some chronic conditions, and you have to know about cannabis and the different preparations to select the right preparation, right formulation for you. But even when you have chronic diseases, it sometimes is the only thing that can work, and it replaces polypharmacy, and which we know is causing all sorts of deaths as well in chronic diseases. And we know, for example, Harry Wink from the University of Ohio is a neuroscientist, and he is looking at research that shows that judicious use of cannabis, small amounts every day, can prevent cognitive decline and dementia.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I take my CBD tincture every morning.
Yeah.
You know, another time I would love to have this. I realize as we're talking about this, how I really am. You two obviously are not, but you're both very educated in this. But I feel really ignorant about drugs in general. Like I don't understand where meth came from, and like how it became what it is. And maybe another time we can talk about that, because you know what, I haven't even seen Breaking Bad, but is it related to the to the speed and what they gave the Nazis and all of that? I mean, just as a little teaser, David, is it? Do you know?
Well, again, there's all of these have a botanical source.
Oh.
So we found things in nature that can bring us down, they could bring us up, they could mellow us out in the center. And we 10,000, 100,000 years of experimentation and watching how the bees and the birds and the monkeys do it, we figured out that some of those things could work on us, trial and error. You want it to be their trial, their error, and your trial, right? So, so there were products like coca leaves, right, that are a stimulant, and poppies that then people used for pain management, and also became used as heroin and a cash crop in Afghanistan. But you mentioned the use of stimulants in war, and I was reading the history of the Blitzkrieg of France by the German forces in 1939, 1940, and they gave their troops on the line, the Germans did, the Nazi troops, continuous doses of speed. By that time, they had created pharmaceutical speed. And they gave them doses to keep them up, keep them aggressive, and keep them going for days so they could blow through the French lines. That's one use of it. Currently today, long-range bomber crews still use stimulants, still use speed to fly from the United States all across the ocean, all the way and back again. So you have to, so there are uses for that. And the stimulus use has been used as initially as a treatment for depression before we discovered antidepressants, and we moved away from botanical treatments like St. John's worts and echinacea and different botanical treatments for depression. So
yeah, what's so disturbing to me is the hypocrisy, you know, and the way that, and I remember reading something a long time ago, like the kind of cocaine that rich people used versus street. So that made a difference in terms of the way they were treated legally. You know, the hypocrisy of it. It's like, if it can just be used the way you're talking about, okay, you know, informed consent, and let's talk about this. But instead, the ugliness and the dirtiness and the all of the stuff around it is definitely profiting a certain sect of society at the expense of others, and that seems to be the through line.
When you look at, since we're focusing on cannabis, and cannabis legalization is legal recreationally in 11 states, 33 medically states, and then there's 11, I think 11, 12 more states this year they're going to have it on their ballot to make it medical, and maybe one or two more adding recreational. So the greatest contributor to prohibition movement is, can you guess? Pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, that makes sense.
Totally. Big pharma. Completely.
I knew that.
Yeah.
And their resistance is data driven by data that people are using that instead of a lot of the pharmaceutical and what you see in states that have legalized it and are using it for medical purposes as well, is a decrease in anti-anxiety pills, depression, and pain pills. So it's hitting their bottom line. So now that's, but I just want to plant a flag here. So cannabis is being looked at now as a botanical medicine, like we've always used botanical medicines. And what we're looking at now is how to make it a safe botanical medicine that is grown green and organically, and it has predictable, recognizable amounts of different cannabis properties. Mm-hmm. We'll get into this more, we can talk about more, but there are 144 different compounds in cannabis. And so we're trying to figure out as human beings, as we've always done, is which combination of those compounds has therapeutic effects for different issues and different medical problems. In addition, just to taking it for wellness and prevention. I mentioned dementia prevention and neuroprotective function of that, but instead of taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatories that cause heart problems and GI ulcer bleeds and stuff like that. A lot of people are using cannabis as a substitute to manage their arthritis pain or intermittent chronic pain, muscle pain, and things like that. So that's what we're seeing out there in the dialogue. And you mentioned informed consent, and that's where I live and breathe, having worked as a psychiatric nurse for 40 years, is people need to know what they're taking, because not everything is the same. What you can't, in the future, maybe in some future conversation, we can talk about the pharmaceutical company and how they research their drugs and cook the books, basically, on a lot of the drugs. So we certainly need a lot of good pharmaceutical drugs that are doing what they need to. Mostly vaccines these days, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I've got a question, David, about something else that I remember hearing that floated around, that now, because of the way they've hybridized marijuana, and that, you know, it can actually be pernicious, and that's related to this gateway drug thing. Do you know about this concept?
Yeah, that goes to the addiction potential, and so the hybridization actually came out of the criminalization. So I was showing that little map. That was all naturally grown and then naturally produced, and most cannabis was a 1-to-1 ratio of THC, which is a psychoactive, to CBD, cannabidiol, which is not psychoactive, but has a lot of health properties that helps regulate stomach issues and mood issues, and is a great pain relief substance, and also neuroprotective. So that's commonly known as CBD, right, versus THC. So when people talk about hybridization, they're usually talking about high THC that started to happen when the growing went inside in response to the DEA helicopters flying over and looking at things. So one of the things I wanted to go back to on the slides, just bear with me here, is about the research. So that's the quote from Sanjay Gupta. And then it includes over on the left side, every 19 minutes, somebody dies of a prescription drug overdose. It doesn't happen with marijuana.
Wow.
So, but people who have certain chronic conditions can sometimes have heart problems and things like that. So they need to be cautious about that, for sure. It's not a panacea, but what he's saying there is that from the drug itself, there's no way to overdose on it. You can have anxiety attacks and things like that, which a lot of people go into the hospital for because they eat edibles and they get too high a dose of it, but they don't die from it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things, so what Sanjay Gupta was talking about was the studies now that have come out since 1999 to 2015. These are meta-studies looking at over 10,700 studies. There is conclusive evidence of medical benefits for chronic pain, nausea and cancer chemotherapy, multiple sclerosis, muscle spasms, neuropathic pain from diabetes and nerve degenerations, and epileptic seizure control. And we have all these different types of routes of administration now because of opening up the cannabis industry and medical cannabis industry in the United States. Human beings being really creative, they figured out different ways of distilling it and using it properly. So over here, you have the smoothie. You can take the cannabis leaves, just the raw cannabis leaves, and mix it up instead of kale or spinach in a smoothie, along with your apple and blueberries and nuts and whatever. And it's a wellness product that helps the vitality of the cells. And you don't, by eating cannabis, you cannot get high, just eating it in the raw form, because it has to be heated to 240 degrees, a process called decarboxylation it chemically changes it from an acid to the psychoactive component. So I have, I grow a few plants here as a medical patient, and and learning upon that, I put it in my smoothies every morning, you know. It's a nice addition to your daily supplements. So these are the other things that we can talk about. There's even cannabis suppositories. There's the tinctures, the updated tinctures and sublingual sprays. Tinctures and sprays are now produced by pharmaceutical companies. You may have heard about the pediatric epilepsy patients. They have a very unique form of epilepsy with chronic seizures, and their Epidolex is a tincture and a spray that they use to control those seizures. It's produced by a pharmaceutical company in London, where it's still illegal to get regular cannabis, by the way. It's kind of interesting.
So David, when you said that you can't get high having it raw, and yet there are things like edibles. So does that mean that when they process it for sale, that those items are heated?
Yeah, they take the flower, which is this here, you know, the bud that people used to smoke and roll up in joints or put in a water pipe. That was the primary way that was used after it was criminalized. You have to, what we found out about that was from research in the 60s through the 1998, especially by the Israelis. Interesting, they've been researching this for like 30 years, that you have to heat the marijuana bud in order for it to change chemically to something that's psychoactive. And so edibles are produced, the edibles that you get in the stores or the beverages that you drink or you have in the tincture or in transdermal patches or in suppositories and in topicals and in this highly concentrated oil, those are made from products that have been heated to 240 degrees, and they've now become, it releases more of those 144 compounds and makes some of them psychoactive. So that's why you see all those products when you go in to the cannabis dispensaries. You know, it's like someone going into a grocery store that's coming from Eastern Europe or something like that, or some other place. They see Target, there's so many things you can buy. And those of us go into dispensaries and go, my goodness, I remember in the 60s, you know, you had to sneak around and stuff, and now it's all out there. What do you start with? And so that's why Clark College asked me to start this class that we've been doing for 3 years. It's been highly attended. And out of that, the community asked for an opportunity to continue to build a patient community, a medical patient community, to share this information. And we've been bringing the community together, doing monthly educational talks up until the pandemic shut us down. But now we figured out a way to do that on Zoom, and we have a website up and running called Cannabis Patients Pacific Northwest, where we're taking this information and putting it up there for people as a community service for them to understand and to ask questions, to continue to educate policymakers, patients, and community growers and people who are in dispensaries about what patients need and how to talk with patients about the products. So we're educating the state and the policymakers and the distributors about what patients need and what kind of stuff they should be growing. Some high THC is fine, but mostly it's one-to-one stuff that people who are cannabis patients want, because the CBD taken in conjunction with THC cancels out the psychoactivity. And this is the way it's been grown for 10,000 years, by the way. And all this has been researched by people outside the United States, and now people inside the United States are researching this. And going back to the DEA and the National Institute for Drug Analysis Enforcement, NIDA, has had a monopoly on the distribution of researchable cannabis products. So let's say you work for a university or some kind of foundation, and you want to research PTSD or Alzheimer's or chronic pain or epilepsy. You can only get this from one source at the university. You can only get the researchable cannabis from one source, University of Mississippi, and it's totally degraded. It is ground up with sticks and stems and seeds. It's totally denatured. It just sits there, all ground up, and that's what they ship out. It has nothing to do with what we used to have or what people find in the dispensaries. But it's still helping people a little bit, but they have to take so much more because it's totally denatured. Sue Sisley, who's an internist and a psychiatrist, has been researching PTSD in Arizona. So she gets that crappy stuff from the University of Mississippi, and she's got these veterans that are taking it for PTSD. And she says, yeah, it's working, but they have to smoke 3 joints. So versus taking 1 puff of hybrid stuff that you get in the dispensary, that's the difference. You don't have to screw with your lungs, or you can take a tincture, right? Or a suppository. There's all these other options out there, but because of how prejudiced we still are about this and how it's influenced our policy and our public health, we've allowed this to happen, and you can't get access to it. And also the process is like 7 years to get access to it to begin with, because there's all these barriers that don't exist for the drug companies. Rushing out a new drug, 6 months, bam. Do you know the side effects? No, we don't know, because we don't know the side effects in the general population that has various DNA. We don't know how they're going to respond to it. And that's how you have the drug recalls after all these, after a couple of years, they recall the drugs. Well, there's too many people dying from, this new anti-inflammatory. Vioxx was one of them. And, but then they don't take it off the market. They put a black label on it, but they still sell it.
Or they say it really, really fast in the TV commercials.
Well, that's really good. And did you notice in the TV commercial when they're saying it really, really fast, that they have people doing really, really fun things? But that's really a video of them doing it before they took the drug, when they died from it.
Right. Now, this has been amazing. I feel like you can almost say like when you started with this with 10,000 years ago, it's like, so it's been like prejudice, profit, and politics that have gotten us from when it was this revered botanical and all of those botanical truths are still with us, to where we are now, where it still feels like we're fighting against the reputation that's been impugned.
I think that's where David comes in, and it's so important, the work he's doing, though, because it's really about educating people. If you believe people have the right information and facts, that people will then understand it better. And I think that's where we are. Wouldn't you agree with that, David? It's really about educating people.
It's educating people under the umbrella of informed consent. Every drug you take, you need to research it, and in the resources, I can link you up to websites that help people get beyond what the drug companies publish about the research, and what doctors don't share with the drug companies, because they list it as, well, that's just you, that's anecdotal information. And I haven't heard that from other patients. And other patients may not be sharing it because they got tired of talking about it with the doctors and keep prescribing it. One of the things, one of the drugs, I mentioned anti-inflammatories that was causing heart attacks. And as I mentioned, my background is in psychiatric nursing, and I worked 40 years in inpatient settings, handing out medications, explaining to people what the side effects are, watching for the side effects, reporting the side effects to doctors, and adding more drugs to deal with the side effects of the drug that's giving the side effects. So you've got the circular thing going on and what's causing what. One of the things in terms of informed consent that I'm particularly concerned about is the antidepressant groups. And we have not been given all the knowledge about that. And in fact, a lot of the articles that were written about antidepressants were ghostwritten in order to get it through publication. And the data was changed so that it didn't include the number of suicide that antidepressants caused, the number of aggressive outbursts that they caused. And get this, after 2 weeks, complete sexual dysfunction for the rest of your life.
Oh, no.
Complete sexual dysfunction, cutting off of libido for the rest of your life.
Oh.
Would you trade that for a couple episodes of depression and trying to figure something else out? You know, so
well, you know,
it's like
it's another issue too, David, for seniors, because I think this idea is well known, is the number of drugs that someone over the age of 65 takes in the U.S., 8 to 11 drugs a day. And after you hit 65, what's the potential to have adverse drug interactions? 100%.
100% of the time.
So it's time when you're seniors and you're having some of these issues to educate ourselves and learn what the options and alternatives, more natural, organic alternatives are, when you just cannot tolerate the effects of the drugs, let alone the side effects. Because you're exactly right, David. We see seniors with this every day in their doctors, and now they're getting drugs to take care of what the drugs did wrong. And so, I mean, I think, you know, if you're open-minded and you're kind of tired of all of that, and the cost too of those medications can add up, then maybe it's worth it to do a little investigating and educating ourselves and just learn about this.
Well, my own personal experience with that, and just going back to the antidepressants, was my mother-in-law, who was in assisted living, and as she had dementia, and she was there for 4 years in assisted living. She was 97 and 3/4 when she passed away.
Wow.
And they kept trying to put her on antidepressants for most of the time that after her husband died, because she had anxiety sometimes. She was a little anxious. And she had the usual side effects from the antidepressants: jitteriness, disruption in concentration, upset. She couldn't sit still. And so being a nurse, I would give that feedback to the doctors, and they said, well, let's wait a little bit longer. And she said, I can't tolerate this anymore. And it took 2 weeks for her to get off of it. So in the last part of her life, the last 6 months, she was getting more and more confused and demented, and but still fairly affable and stuff. So the physician said, well, let's try an antidepressant. Maybe that'll perk her up and give her more energy. She also was having less energy naturally because of the dementia, right? So they put her on a very well-known antidepressant that they've been using for dementia patients to increase their energy. And it totally knocked her out. She could not pick her head up off of the pillow. She was totally confused. So we went in and met with the doctor and said, well, you know, this isn't working. How about we stop this? And would you be willing to try some CBD tincture? Because you know, the literature is showing that it helps with the confusional states and anxiety, and can also then, and with her mood regulation, it might give her more energy, because the antidepressant is totally making her unavailable, and she just becomes a vegetable. So the doctor agreed to that. However, because of the federal guidelines, she was in an assisted living and they were getting federal money under Medicaid, Medicare. They wouldn't let it be prescribed. I brought the prescription in. I said, here's the prescription, here it is, just like we do with the vitamin, right? And they would give her D3 or whatever, vitamins, multivitamins. That was the process we've been using in the assisted living. I gave that to them and they said, we can't give it to her because of the federal guidelines. We're getting money from them, they'll cut off our money. So I had to go in twice a day and give it to her myself for 2 months. And after all of that, I said, the hell with this, we'll just bring her home and treat her at home. And that's what we did. And it helped incredibly. She was off for a lot of those drugs. It also lowers blood pressure medication. She didn't need as much of that. And it settled down her GI upset because, and we can get into that in future sessions if we're going to do some on the medical implications of it and what it works for. And I showed you some of that in the previous slide. And another, just staying with the aging population. I know, Helen, you work with the aging population a lot, and you've involved me with that work. And so after I did the classes at Clark College, and I started doing community talks on this, aside from Clark College, but just going out and educating people as my community service, I started going into I started being invited into assisted living, to Parkinson's support groups, to 55 and older communities. And people would come up to me and tell me what they're using. You know, I said, oh yeah, you like that one, huh? Okay, good. How's that help you? So people are already experimenting and working by word of mouth, maybe doing a little bit of research on the internet, which was great, and which is why we started this educational group called Cannabis Patients Pacific Northwest, and we're now applying for nonprofit status, and we have a website that, can I show that to you now?
Please.
Okay, that's the last slide. So, for more information, you can contact us at Cannabis Patients Pacific Northwest or email us. And all of this is based on the research that we've conducted and that I've collected from the cannabis community. And now we have activists and advocates and other educators coming together under this umbrella of Cannabis Patients Pacific Northwest. I'll see if we can go to this site. I don't know if it'll show up on your web. Can you see that?
No. Now
Okay.
we're back at the slide. Who's invited to come in? Come to that.
Anybody who
Anybody?
wants. Anybody who wants. This I'll send. So we have an email distribution list, and the website just went live 2 weeks ago. We've been working on it for about a year, mostly trying to find someone who volunteered at a time because I don't have money for it. $3,000 to do a website. And I found this person who volunteered, created a wonderful website. And let's see, I think I can share my screen here again. And there it is. Can you see it now?
Yes.
There it is. So we got education, you click on that. It takes you to routes of administration, dosing for cancer treatment, traumatic brain injury, palliative cancer care, autism, and neuroprotection. And then events. Our monthly meetup over Zoom now. Now that we're going to be in COVID for a while, COVID lockdown, we figured out we're not going to be able to do presentation in the community. So we're going to Zoom. And then patient resources takes you to how to obtain a medical cannabis card in Washington and Oregon. And then recommended brands and products, and then the 4 cannabis dispensaries, medical cannabis dispensaries in Southwest Washington and those in Oregon, and then recommended, that's not showing up there, I'll have to go back to, anyway, we also have cannabis medical professionals that you can go to and see on there. So I'll stop that. So this is what happens if you say yes to someone at Clark College who says, can you create a curriculum for us in community education about cannabis and your health? And 3 years later, because of informed consent and the value, and because of what I was learning working with Helen on aging and aging in the brain and how to protect, how to stay healthy and living in your own home. All of that came together out of that. So thank you, Helen, for your work there.
Thank you, David. It's all related. Okay, so
Thank you both. Thank you so much, David. Thank you both. This has been so educational and vibrantly interesting. Thank you.
thank you, David.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, so stay curious, ask questions, and stay cool in the Couve.
Yeah.
Right.
See you next time.
Okay.